Hi, this is Lorraine Watry, and this video is going to go over the watercolor supplies that I suggest for my students to use in my classes. And I know there's a lot of information following, and please don't worry about it. I wanted to try to go over as much as I could, and you may want to take a couple times to kind of go through it, but wanted to give everyone as much information as I could to hopefully make it helpful to make decisions on supplies when you're purchasing them. And if you're one of my students and have signed up for a class or a workshop, always feel free to email me and I will help you with any questions you might have about the following supplies. Thanks, and I hope the following information is helpful. Hi, this is Lorraine Watry, and this video is going to go over watercolor supplies for both my students and others that might want to learn the watercolor medium. I will be going over watercolor paper, brushes, paint, and other supplies. Before I get started talking about watercolor paper, I want to mention that it's important to use professional or artist grade supplies because it will make a difference in what you are seeing and how things are working with watercolor. I will revisit this as I talk about the supplies. It would be better to look for an art store in your area or online because they will carry most of these supplies in the professional level compared to the student grade supplies that most craft stores carry. Okay, starting with watercolor paper, most of the time I paint on Arch's brand of watercolor paper. Watercolor paper comes in different forms. One of the standards is a sheet of watercolor paper that is 22 by 30 that you can see here. It can also come in tablets, blocks, and rolls. There are two standard terms when talking about watercolor paper. There are different surfaces and different weights. The three surfaces are hot press, it is smooth, cold press with some texture, and rough that has the most texture. And I will try to show you the difference, so I'll bring this up closer to the camera. That's the hot press, so it is a smoother surface. And then the cold press has some texture to it. And I don't know if you can see the difference between those two. And I'll hold them there together. So cold press has some texture. And then compared to a piece of rough paper, the texture should be more on the rough paper. And then I will show you a difference between, this is Arch's rough on the left and a piece of the Fabriano Arch's rough, Fabriano rough on the right. And they have the most texture. Rough has the most texture. So the rough paper, the cold press paper, and hot press paper. And I think you can also see there's a difference in the creaminess of these. So these are a little creamier in color and these are a little whiter in color. And I paint on the Arch's bright white paper, and Fabriano also has a brighter paper or whiter paper, and it's called extra white. So depending on what surface you like to paint on, you might look for either the traditional kind of creamy look to the paper, or look for something that's a little whiter in the brand of paper that you like. The other thing to know about watercolor paper is that there are different weights of paper. On the low side, you can get 90-pound paper, which is very thin and like a piece of paper you might put in a printer. And then more common that most people doing watercolor will use will be 140-pound paper, and it has still some give to it. And then up from that would be 200-pound paper, and some brands don't carry 200. And then 300-pound paper, which is more like painting on a piece of thin cardboard. And then Arch's brand even has a 400-pound paper, which would be even thicker. When you're talking about the weight of the paper, basically if you had 500 sheets approximately of the 22 by 30 paper. That is a ream of paper, and this those 500 sheets, when they are weighed, if it's 140 pound paper, that ream of paper will weigh 140 pounds. If you were weighing 500 sheets of approximately of the 300 pound paper, then that ream would weigh 300 pounds. So that's where the weight of the paper comes from. On the practical side of things, 300 pound paper is thicker and will not buckle as much when you're painting on it, and so you don't have to staple or tape it down, and if you use a very wet wash, it may only move a little bit. It won't necessarily curl and bend. Then paper that is lighter than 300 pounds can buckle more and cause hills and valleys while you're painting. And there is a way to avoid buckling when working on lighter weight paper, and I will go into that in a few minutes. I use Arches 140 pound cold press bright white paper, and this is a sample of that, and then this is the full sheet of that. And I like my paper as white as I can get it, and so that's why I use the bright white. The cold press paper is a middle of the road paper, meaning that you can get some of the same qualities as the rough paper because it has a textured surface, and some of the things that you can do with the hot press paper you can still achieve and do on the cold press paper. Arches watercolor paper is 100% cotton, and it can handle the rougher watercolor techniques like scrubbing, lifting, masking fluid, scraping, and tape. Most of the professional grade papers are made from 100% cotton instead of wood pulp or other fibers, and they are acid free too. However, just because they are made from 100% cotton, you should try out some of the techniques because they don't all handle scrubbing, masking fluid, or rougher techniques the same way. Watercolor paper can be torn or cut down into smaller pieces. So just because you are getting a piece of paper that is this size doesn't mean you need to use it this size. A quarter sheet would be 11 by 15, and a half sheet would be 15 by 22, and then the full sheet is 22 by 30. And I can also cut it down into long narrow strips. I could cut it down into small 5 by 7s or whatever size I might need. You can also use both the front and the back of the paper, and the way you tell if it is the front, on most papers the front is just a little smoother texture than the back of the paper's texture. Another form of watercolor paper is in a block, and a block is a tablet of watercolor paper. Let me move this out of the way. And this is one example, and I will grab a couple others here. And a block of paper is sealed so that you can only get to the top piece of paper. And they come with some kind of paper covering it usually. Not every brand does that, but Arches has a piece of black paper on the top when you first get it. One thing about watercolor paper in general is that you should be careful with it. You don't want to get oils from your hands, chemicals, or soaps on it. Also be careful that it doesn't get scratched. If you are traveling to and from a class, you should transfer the paper in plastic or a portfolio to protect it. With a watercolor block, the sides are glued or sealed, and you will need a blade or a palette knife to slip into the opening to pull the top sheet off when you're done. And this brand has an opening on both sides and is only sealed on two ends. The Sennelier block has again the opening there, and then Fabriano has it on the corner. And depending on the brand of paper, sometimes the seal is better than other brands, and this one, the edges didn't stay together as well, so I used masking tape around the edges to keep them tight on the edges. So the watercolor paint and water will not transfer from the top sheet down to the next sheet when you're painting on a watercolor block. And one of the reasons to possibly use a watercolor block is because the edges are contained so that they hold the paper a little flatter and you don't get as much buckling. So even though these are 140-pound paper, it's effectively like it's been stretched because it's being held on the edges. They're also very portable, and one of the disadvantages of a block is that you can only use one sheet at a time. So unless you want to take the paper off and attach it to something else, you are limited to just this top surface. When I use a sheet of 140-pound paper, to keep it from buckling, I will stretch my paper. And I have a pretty quick method for stretching paper. And I use a surface to stretch the watercolor paper onto. Move those. And I will pull out a Gatorfoam. And this is either Gatorboard or Gatorfoam, depending on where you find it and how they have it listed. And this is on my supply list. And it is a surface that I can stretch my watercolor paper onto. It is basically foam core, and then it has a hard surface on this side and the other side. And then I have taken white masking tape on this one and taped the edges to protect them because of the hard surface. If you bang it against something, they can crack or ding. And then I have an example of a piece of paper that is attached to it, and I use just a regular household staples to staple it to my board. This is a lightweight board. It comes in different sizes. This is a half sheet size, and it's just a little bit bigger than my half sheet of watercolor paper, which is 15 by 22. And the board can be cut, so if you want to have a quarter sheet, or you could have any size basically, if you have a certain size that you like to paint in, so the board can be cut down. These are available at almost all the online art stores, and at my local art store, Meininger's, it's available there as well. And they come in all different sizes. I have several that are full sheet size boards, and then I have one that is, I think it's about 36 by 40 in size. It's pretty large. You can also use them, even if you use a 300-pound kind of paper, you could tape your 300-pound paper to this and then use it as a way to lift your paper up so that when you're doing the watercolor techniques, the bead of water and paint as you're working down your paper will flow down with gravity, and so that you don't end up with backruns and other issues. So a quick run through of how I do my stretching is I do my drawing on the watercolor paper, and then once I have my drawing done, I will take my paper to the sink or to a container that has kind of lukewarm water or room temperature water in it. And normally your paper will stand up, even the 90-pound paper will stand up on its own. 300-pound obviously has a little more weight to it, will stand up. And the 140-pound paper, when I wet it on both sides, it can take about 3 to 5 minutes, and you just keep kind of flipping it over and getting it wet everywhere. And even over your pencil line, the pencil line will not wash off. And depending on what kind of pencil you use, I use a 2B mechanical pencil to do my drawing. And once I have my paper wet on both sides and the paper flops over, then it's ready to put down on my board. And I lay it down on the board, and then I staple on the longer end first, and then go to the opposite side and staple, and then I staple the other sides. And I split the staples maybe somewhere between 1 inch to 1.5 inches for spacing in between. And at this point the paper is going to be very wet, and it will take somewhere around 4 hours, sometimes overnight, depending on the moisture in the air and how wet your paper is. And then once it's dry, then I can either start painting on it or I can mask things. And then the paper, when I'm painting on it, won't give me a lot of buckle and hills and valleys while I'm painting, and it's a lot easier to paint on. So I will be putting a video up about how to stretch watercolor paper, and that was just a quick example of what I do. A book that goes over watercolor paper that I've had on my shelf for a while now, and I'm not sure if you can see that title. Hopefully it will catch it one way or the other there. It's called Watercolor Paper Handbook, and it's by Werner Mertz. And it's a good source if you're trying watercolor paper for the first time or want to try other brands or surfaces of paper. It has a sample of what the surfaces look like, and it goes over quite a few brands. It doesn't have all the brands in here, but it talks about the surface sizing and shows examples. And you need sizing in your paper, because if you didn't have it, it would be like painting on a paper towel, where if you put down paint, it would just flow and you wouldn't be able to get hard edges. The sizing also keeps the watercolor brilliant and keeps lines and edges looking crisp. And some papers have both internal sizing and external sizing, and most stores carry a variety of professional grade, most art stores carry a variety of professional grade watercolor papers. They can also be ordered online, and I have a list with links for online sites in the notes of this video. Some of the paper that you can get at a craft store is more of a student grade paper rather than professional grade. And this, let's see, this is the Canson brand, and depending on where you are, it is maybe easier to find the watercolor paper in a craft store, but I think there's a problem with thinking that you should go with the student grade because you're just starting out, because the trials that I ran on it showed me that there were some things with watercolor techniques that don't work as well on the student grade paper. And one of the things that I also noted was that this Canson tablet said Artist Series, so even if it says Artist Series on it, and I'm not sure if this one says, I don't see it saying that it's 100% cotton, so this may be made out of some other kind of fiber, whether it's wood pulp or some other fiber. And so what I noticed, and I'll pull over the other sample, is that the student grade papers, which both of these are, this is a Canson, it says Montval watercolor paper, and this one is Canson XL watercolor. They both say they're cold press and 140 pounds in weight. And what happened with the student grade paper is that they both had some issues with some of the techniques that I did as trials. And so when I put a piece of masking tape down and some masking fluid, and then I tried some other things, and I will be talking about this more in depth in the other paper video that I do. But very quickly, I just wanted to show you that this is a wet and wet wash on Arches watercolor paper, and this is the same kind of wet and wet wash on Fabriano paper. And what happened was I put down the water, and then I dropped basically or put paint into that wash, and it gave me a soft focus and fluid kind of feel to it. And on the student grade papers, because of what the surface is made out of, they started to dry before I could get the next color onto the paper. So I started with blue on all of these, and these papers, that blue was already starting to dry before I could get the next color onto the paper. And so I ended up with back runs and blooms and things because this was already drawing before I put that Watercolor next to it. So that was one of the issues for both of those. And then another issue was that when I scrubbed out some color, which is a common thing to do with watercolor, both of these papers ended up tearing and had very rough surfaces after I scrubbed on them. And the Arches and the Fabriano paper didn't have an issue with the scrubbing technique. There was a little bit on the Fabriano that was lifted and possibly a little bit there, but these this color is a color that sometimes is harder to lift off the paper. So, and then the other thing I noticed was that same issue of the paper starting to dry before I got the color on everywhere. And so where I move these out of the way, where I painted around the tape and the masking fluid, the color that was put down started to bloom and have issues on the student grade paper, where it was just a nice smooth wash of color on the Arches and the Fabriano paper. So, and I've noticed when students have the student grade paper in my classes that they have problems with it. So even though you might feel like you're saving some money and buying the student grade paper, what will happen is you may end up being discouraged by it and either not continuing or having to go back out and buy better paper. So that said, for my classes, buying a sheet of the watercolor paper that is 22 by 30, even if you can buy just a couple of these, this will be fine for my classes. And you, like I said, you can paint on both sides, and they run somewhere between $5 to $8 for a sheet. And most of the online stores, if you look there, you can only get them in packages, full sheet in packages of five pieces of this. But it is a better price to do that than possibly sometimes to buy them in a local art store. However, you might go to your local art store and price things out because it might be just as good to purchase through them. So I would suggest looking for the more professional grade watercolor paper, because the techniques and things that we do with watercolor are going to work a lot better on the professional grade compared to the student grade. So I'll move these. And then, there is another tablet. Those two that I showed you that were student grade are considered tablets of watercolor paper. And Arches brand now has a tablet, or maybe they've had it for a while, but I hadn't noticed it before. They have a tablet that you can buy that is connected on one end, and then loose. The paper is loose on the other edges. And then this is one I happen to have that's a brand called Kilimanjaro, and I believe it's a Cheap Joe's. It's manufactured by Cheap Joe's, and they're one of the online art stores that you can buy paper from. This tablet is one that has a piece of watercolor paper, and then it also has, in between the watercolor paper, it has a piece of drawing paper. So you can both paint on it and you can sketch and take notes in there if you would like. And it is a 140-pound cold press, and they might have some that are other brands as well. And this one's called their Watercolor Paint Book. On the other hand, I did see a professional grade block of Arches watercolor paper at one of the craft stores, and I was shocked at the price. That same block at an art store or online art store would be about 1/3 the price, and even with a discount coupon it would be more expensive than from the art store. For my classes, if you can get only 1 to 2 full sheets of the 22 by 30 professional watercolor paper like Arches, or one of the blocks from Arches or Fabriano, that paper or the block will be enough to take care of doing techniques and studies in my classes. And you can use both front and back of it. And next on my class supply list, I will talk about watercolor brushes.